Hey guys, and welcome to our new channel. My name is Cam. We started this channel a while ago with Cam Spires, and the original idea was to talk about various topics in ancient history, review academic journal articles, review books, review debates, organize debates, and stuff like that. Unfortunately, Cam also decided to finish his degree in physics, and it turned out it's actually much more time consuming than he thought. So at least for a while, I will be streaming alone. And the reason why it took me so much time to put this together is because for the past couple of months, I've been negotiating very intensively with the Pine Creek headquarters in Wichita, Kansas, about me obtaining the official legal right to give out Pine points. And I can inform you that after months of negotiations, we actually managed to draft the full contract. I will sign it here live on the stream. So as of now, I can actually give you guys Pine points. And these are real Pine points, not just like a different digital currency or some fake version of Pine points. This is the real deal. They are the same you will be given on Pine Creek's channel, and they of course count towards the 1 million Pine point prize of a full vacation in luxurious Tropicana with Pine Creek, all expenses covered. And on top of all of that, I will show you something that has actually never been seen on camera. This is what I've been sent by the Pine Creek headquarters in Wichita, Kansas. As you can see, it's an early Christmas gift. And what's in this book is actually a real physical Pine point. It's not just a digital representation. This is the real thing. It's one of the Pine points that are normally stored in the Wichita headquarters secret vault. I can't unfortunately show it to you now. I can't open the box because it's sleeping. But I saw it earlier today, and it's a real Pine point. It floats and everything. So it's very exciting. And if my information is correct, the first person to receive 1,000 Pine points for commenting first in this live stream is none other than Nathan Ormond of the Digital Gnosis channel. So massive congratulations. And let's do this. So what is the topic of this stream, right? Well, a while ago, I happened to have a conversation with Pine Creek Daka over on his channel. You will actually see the link of the full conversation down below. And we were talking about the traditional authorship of the four canonical Gospels, them being written, by Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. And basically, the short summary of that stream is it's very, very improbable, given what we know about ancient historiography, that these two claims are true at the same time. One, that the traditional Gospel authorship is correct, and two, that the canonical Gospels were written in the genre of ancient Greco-Roman historical biography, bios in ancient Greek and vita in Latin. And the reason for that is, most importantly or primarily when it comes to the Gospel of Mark and Matthew, we don't actually see them making any claims about being written by eyewitnesses or being informed by eyewitness testimony. And this is very unusual if they are written in this genre and if the traditional authorship is correct, because we know from looking at other works in that genre that eyewitness testimony was very important for ancient historians. And when they were themselves eyewitnesses to the events that they describe, or they had access to eyewitness sources, either oral sources, so they actually interviewed someone who was an eyewitness, or written eyewitness sources, so they cite a previous work written by someone who was an eyewitness to the events. They say so, because why wouldn't they? It makes them more credible, it makes it more interesting. You can very often see that they are excited about it. So we should definitely expect, if the traditional gospel authorship is correct, and if the gospels were actually written in this genre, that they would also make these kinds of claims, but they don't. And in that stream, we went over various examples showing that this is typical, not unusual. Because sometimes people might respond by saying, well, the literary conventions in the ancient world were different than they are in literature today. And historians either didn't talk about themselves or they talked about themselves in the third person or something like that. And the point of the stream was to show that this isn't actually the case. And there is a number of examples where historians talk about themselves, they talk about themselves in the first person, and when they are eyewitnesses to the events they are describing, they actively say so. And when they have access to eyewitness testimony, they actively say so. Because again, why wouldn't they? And today, given that it's just two of us and we have all the time that we need, I thought it might be interesting to go over some of the examples in a little bit more detail and really show you guys how this looks like outside the canonical Gospels in Greco-Roman literature. And I chose one specific ancient historian to talk about. His name is Ammianus Marcellinus. He wrote in the second half of the 4th century CE. He was a Greek, and he was a soldier in the Roman army for many years. And he personally participated in a number of military campaigns, including a campaign of the Romans against the Neo-Persian Empire, the Sassanids, led by Emperor Julian, during which Julian was actually wounded and died on the campaign. And the Roman army had to fight back through Mesopotamia, back into the Roman Empire. And you might be asking yourself, okay, how do we know that this is the case? What amazing early attestation do we have about life of Ammianus Marcellinus? Is there some equivalent of Papias or Irenaeus who tells us about who Ammianus Marcellinus was? Well, we actually know all of these things because he says them in the book himself. And there is a great deal of information that we can actually learn about his own life because he informs us. So let's talk about his work. It's important to realize that not all of his work actually survives. The work had 31 books, but only books 14 to 31 survive, and books 1 to 13 are lost. And what's unfortunately lost also is the introduction, where Ammianus Marcellinus maybe named himself specifically, right? So he talks about himself in the first person quite often, but his name is actually not found anywhere in the text. And if he named himself, that would be found in the introduction to his work, which would either be at the beginning of book 1, or it would be a preface. But we have examples of ancient historians who do that, and their works are preserved. So we can get an idea of how that would look like if that actually existed. So this is, for example, Introduction to the Jewish War written by Josephus. Josephus himself was an eyewitness to the events. He was also an active participator. He actively shaped the events because, unlike Ammianus Marcellinus, who was basically just a soldier, Josephus was not only fighting, he was actually in the initial stages of the Jewish war, one of the Jewish leaders of the Jewish uprisings. And later he was captured by the Romans. And as we can see, he names himself in the text in the introduction, and he indicates that he's the author. But back to Ammianus Marcellinus, right? So we don't have the introduction. We have roughly 60% of the work. We don't actually know how long the lost books were, but we can make some estimates based on the length of the surviving books. Because sometimes ancient authors actually tell us how long various books were. This is an excerpt from a biography of an ancient Greek philosopher named Xenocrates. He was one of the early Platonics. And towards the end of the biography, the author of the biography, Diogenes Laertius, actually lists all the works that were written by Xenocrates, and he tells us how long they were. He tells us in numbers of books, and this was very important because many works in ancient history actually had multiple books, and before the invention of the codex, like an actual book like this, works of literature were sold on papyrus scroll, so every book would actually represent like a physical scroll. And if the work had multiple books, then you would buy a collection of scrolls that would be somehow put together, for example, in a jar. So it was kind of important to know how many books various works have, because when you're buying it, you need to know whether you're actually buying the whole thing, right? And in some cases, he is even more specific. He tells us how many lines on the papyrus scroll the entire work had. Unfortunately, we don't have this for the lost books by Ammianus Marcellinus of his history, but we can make some educated guesses because the extant works, the extant books, the books that were actually preserved, are all about the same length, right? It's between 20 and 25 pages of our codex, our standard book. There are some exceptions. Some books are shorter, and that's because there are gaps even in the preserved text. So based on that, we can extrapolate. And the reason why the books have the rich length or similar length is because that was just the amount of text that fit on the standard papyrus scroll, right? So when Ammianus wrote, he bought a bunch of papyrus scroll, and he either wrote the text himself or he dictated it to someone. And the scrolls that he bought had a standardized length that was just available on the market. So based on that, we can estimate how long the entire work was. And what's really interesting is to compare the length with the amount of time that it covers. So as you can see here, the first 13 books that are lost actually cover a very long period of time. And the rest of the work, the books that we actually have that are extant, cover a very short amount of time, only about 25 years. And the reason why in these last books that we happened to have, the narration suddenly gets much more detailed and much more rich. So it takes much more space to narrate events of a short period of time. It's because these are the books that contain events that Ammianus Marcellinus actually personally witnessed. And this is probably one of the reasons why these specific books, and not the previous ones, were preserved until this day, right? It seems to be the case that the lost books, the books that we no longer have, were mostly compilations of works of previous historians, and they didn't really have that much value. So later scribes who had to make decisions about what to copy decided not to preserve them. He starts his history in the year 96. This is what we know, because that's what he says in the last paragraph of the entire work, because he perceived himself to be continuing the work of a previous very famous Roman historian, Tacitus, who finished his history in the year 96 in the reign of Emperor Nerva. And Ammianus Marcellinus just thought about himself as continuing the work of Tacitus, so he just naturally started his history in the same year that Tacitus concluded. But we only have the last couple of books that cover the last 25 years, which are the events he himself witnessed. So what does he actually say? Let's just start by noting how he talks about his sources. So here is a passage that describes events taking place in Gaul, in today's France. And Ammianus Marcellinus introduces his sources about geography and ethnography of Gaul. He says the ancient writers, in doubt as to the earliest origin of the Gauls, have left an incomplete account of the matter. But later, Timagenes, a true Greek in accuracy as well as language, collected of various works, books in various books these facts that had long been forgotten, which, following his authority and avoiding any obscurity, I shall state clearly and plainly. So here, as you can see, he's actually naming his source. He specifically says who is he talking about, and it gives some information about him. And this is really interesting because if the canonical Gospels were actually written in the same standard as this work, A Roman History by Ammianus Marcellinus, we would, for example, absolutely expect the Gospel of Matthew to say that there was a guy named Mark who wrote a Gospel before him, and maybe say that it's based on the eyewitness testimony of Peter. Because again, why wouldn't he, right? There is every reason for him to do that, and no reason for him not to. And we obviously know that both the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke used Mark as a source, because there are very long strings of words that are exactly identical in the Gospel of Mark and in the other two synoptics. And I thought I would actually show you some examples, because this is often mentioned, but I don't think that many people have ever looked at just how striking these verbal parallels are in the canonical Gospels. So here's an excerpt from the Gospel of Mark with the matching segment from the Gospel of Matthew. It's Jesus' call to Apostle Levi, or Matthew, depending which Gospel you read, and then the dinner at his house. And what's marked in yellow are the sections where there is an exact word-for-word agreement between the two Gospels. So this doesn't happen in eyewitness testimony, obviously. This doesn't happen with two different eyewitness sources remembering the same events. And this also doesn't happen with oral transmission, with retelling the same story by two different people who both heard it from some oral source. And this also doesn't happen if the author of the Gospel of Matthew, whoever he might be, just read the Gospel of Mark at some point in the past, right? It can't be the case that the author of the Gospel of Matthew read the Gospel of Mark and, let's say, a year later or even a week later decided to write his own Gospel. These kind of exact verbal parallels only take place in situations when one of the authors writing actually has the work of the other author in front of them. So when the author of the Gospel of Matthew was writing his Gospel, he had a scroll or a codex of the Gospel of Mark in front of him, and he just copied it basically word for word. And we can also see when the two texts are different, why they are different. So in the first paragraph, he changes the name of the apostle from Levi, the son of Alphaeus, to a man named Matthew. In the second paragraph, he omits the last sentence, which just says that many gathered there. And in the third paragraph, he gets rid of, the author of the Gospel of Matthew gets rid of repetition, because in the Gospel of Mark, the words sinner and tax collector are actually included twice in like two sentences that are next to each other. So you can kind of see someone like the author of the Gospel of Matthew wanted to streamline it by basically cutting one of the two instances out. So this is why pretty much everyone agrees that the synoptic Gospels are mutually dependent, specifically that the author of the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke use the Gospel of Mark. But if we actually compare it to the work of Ammianus Marcellinus, and these Gospels were written in the genre of ancient Greco-Roman historiography, we would absolutely expect them to say, look, there was a guy named Mark who wrote a Gospel before me. I'm using him as a source. And we would, I guess, also expect him to say that this Gospel was based on the eyewitness testimony of Peter. But this is not what we find. So let's move on to Ammianus Marcellinus. So here we have him not only talking about his sources, but also about him talking about two different versions of the same story. So essentially two different sources. Here the situation is the death of Emperor Valens. So Emperor Valens went missing in the Battle of Hadrianopolis, which was probably the greatest military defeat of the Romans by barbarians, by the Goths, in late antiquity, and it massively contributed to the final crisis of the Roman Empire, which resulted to the Western Roman Empire ceasing to exist. And Emperor Valens went missing. His body was never found, and he was presumed dead. And obviously, various people circulated various accounts about how he died. And Ammianus Marcellinus, probably because he doesn't know which one is true, gives two different versions of the story. So he gives one, and then in this passage he says, others say that, basically indicating that there are at least two different versions. And again, this is something that we never find in the Gospels. So in the Gospels, the author almost never enters the narration himself. We don't have this stream of the authorial voice being present in the actual text, and he never indicates any uncertainty or doubt about any of the events happening. He never says, some people think this, but other people think that. But this is exactly what we find in ancient Greco-Roman historiography. It's very, very common. And it's actually one of the hallmarks of the authors being good historians. It's very counterintuitive that them expressing doubt about their own account actually raises our confidence in what they have to say. But it does, because it shows us they are critically evaluating their sources, and they are including a discussion about the quality and nature of their sources in their actual work. So here in this example, the other account of death of Emperor Valens has to do with him being injured. He was taken to a house near the battlefield to be given medical treatment, but the house was surrounded by the enemies who couldn't break in, so they just lit the house on fire, and Emperor Valens and other people with him were burned alive, basically. And that's the reason why his body was never found. It was burned. But if you think about it, there is a very interesting question. How do we know that? More specifically, how did the story circulated if everyone involved was burned? Because the Goths, the enemies of the Romans, were probably not the source about, not the source of the story. So someone else must have communicated the story to Ammianus Marcellinus eventually, right? And Ammianus Marcellinus actually tells us who that person was. He says that in the house there was one young man who managed to escape, and he's the source behind the story. Right? And again, this is something that we never find in the Gospels. In the Gospels, there are various passages where it's very difficult for us to imagine how the author knows about the events he's describing. And he never tells us how he knows that. He never gives any indication that he has any sources. There are at least two prominent examples. One is the things that Jesus does in the Garden of Gethsemane right before his arrest, when the disciples are sleeping. So the disciples presumably can't be the source of information because they were sleeping. And maybe after they wake up, Jesus just told them what happened, what he was doing when they were sleeping. But the thing is that he was being arrested. So I always imagining him being dragged by the guards and just shouting to the disciples. And by the way, make sure that when you write Gospels, 40 years later, this is include what I was doing when you were sleeping just then, right? And the other example is Jesus having various conversations with the people who interrogated him, primarily Pontius Pilate. And apologists sometimes suggest that surely there must have been some slave girl, some servant in the same room that overheard the conversation, and she is actually the eyewitness source behind the account. Because again, the supposed authors, the gospel writers, were not there, so how do they know? Which is fine, I guess. It's of course completely ad hoc, but okay. But the thing is that the Gospels never actually indicate that they have a source like that. They never named the source. And if they were written in the genre of Greco-Roman biography, we would expect them to mention that, just like Ammianus Marcellinus mentions it here. Now, it's maybe it's important to stop and ask, like, am I just buying this because Ammianus Marcellinus says so? Should I play a jingle similar to the one that Pologia has on his channel? When instead of for the Bible tells me so, for Ammianus Marcellinus tells me so. Do I just take this at face value? Of course not. This account could be entirely fictitious. And it's not very difficult to imagine how that account would develop, because Emperor Valens disappeared. His body was never found. So people were being curious about what actually happened. So they started circulating different stories. Maybe this was just a suggestion. Maybe some soldiers knew that some houses were burned by the gods after the battle. So someone suggested that actually the emperor might have been burned alive in one of the houses. But then, as the story circulated, it changed from a suggestion to like a positive account that this is what actually happened, right? I can imagine this happening very easily. And then someone asked the question, well, how do you know that if everyone in alive? So the claim about the eyewitness was added to the story. But whether this actually happened or not is beside the point. Even if that didn't happen, it's very telling that Ammianus Marcellinus, an author of an ancient Greco-Roman historiography, shapes the story and tells the story this way. He indicates that there are at least two different versions, and he informs the audience about who the eyewitness is, which is something, again, that we don't find in the Gospels. And if the traditional authorship is correct, and the Gospels were written in the genre of Greco-Roman biography, this is very unexpected. Here is another amazing example. Ammianus says, and since I have seen many condemned, he's talking about trials and intrigues in the emperor's court, where a lot of people were accused of various, basically intriguing conspiring against the emperor. They were usually tortured and executed. So about this, Ammianus says, and since I have seen many condemnations, after horrible tortures, but everything is a jumble of confusion, as in times of darkness, I shall, since the complete recollection of what was done has escaped me, give a brief and summary account of what I can recall. This is actually amazing, because Ammianus Marcellinus is being critical not only of his sources, but also about himself. And this is another hallmark of a good ancient historian, because when he has doubt, when he has uncertainties, he's open about it and he talks about it. And in this case, he's even uncertain about his own recollection. We don't never find anything like that in the Gospels. The authors in the Gospels never actually never interrupt the narration to tell us, look, what I'm going to tell you now, I'm not entirely sure how that happened. My memory is not perfect. My recollection isn't perfect. I will try to do as good of a job as I can, but it's not, it's going to be 100%, right? And again, we have a very counterintuitive situation when an ancient historian who actively expresses the fact that his information is not perfect actually raises our confidence in what he has to say. Because again, it shows us that he's being very reflexive of the process of writing history, and he realizes that there are these epistemic limitations on him, placed on him, and he tries to work with them. And again, this is something that we never find in the Gospels. Do you know where we also don't find it, by the way, in works of fiction, in fictitious accounts that are maybe based on real events and feature real people like Jesus, Pontius Pilate, and so on, but are actually otherwise entirely fictitious. For example, the biography of Apollonius of Tyana. Here is another really interesting example, and we are no longer talking about sources. We are just talking about Ammianus Marcellinus talking about himself. So here we have himself talking about events that he actually witnessed. So I'm just going to read it out loud. It's a bit long, but I think it's worth it. And notice how he actually talks about himself. What kind of stories he narrates, the level of detail that he provides. Therefore, for the fear that the roads might be blocked, we hastened at full speed. And when we were within 2 miles, we saw a fine-looking boy wearing a neck chain, a child 8 years old, as we guessed, and the son of a man of position, as he said. Again, he's telling us where he got that information from, right? Crying in the middle of the highway, his mother, while she was fleeing wild with fear of the pursuing enemy, being hampered and agitated, have left him alone, while I, at the command of my general, who was filled with pity, set the boy before me on my horse and took him back to the city. The villagers, after building a rampart around the entire wall, were raging, I think that should say raging, more wildly. And because the calamities of the siege alarmed me, and I set the boy down within a half-open postern gate, and with winded speed hastened breathless to our troop, and I was all but taken prisoner. We don't find any of that in the Gospel of Matthew, right? Even though Matthew, the tax collector, who was personally handpicked by Jesus and was one of the 12, must have been physically present during most of the story. So why doesn't he say so? Maybe it would be too much to ask him to narrate the entire gospel this way, but I think it's very, very expected, if he was the actual author, and if the gospel is written in this genre, that he would indicate it at least once. And again, we find nothing like this in the Gospel of Mark, who was supposedly based on the eyewitness testimony of Peter. And the final example that I want to show you is this. Ammianus Marcellinus was actually personally witnessed the Neo-Persian army marching against the Romans, and he describes how that happened. He says, "To him I was sent with a centurion of tried loyalty for the purpose of getting better informed of what was going on, and I reached him over pathless mountains and through steep defiles. And he had seen and recognized me and received me cordially. I confined to him alone the reason of my presence. Thereupon, with one silent attendant who knew the country, he sent me to some lofty cliffs a long distance from there, from which, unless one's eyesight was impaired, even the smallest object was visible at a distance of 50 miles. And what follows is the actual description of the Persian army. Here, it's a little bit cliché. It's a literary trope in ancient literature. One of the literary tropes of ancient literature is a description of an army. We see it all the time in ancient historians, right? So they usually, and this is the case also with Ammianus Marcellinus, they say, what were the names and positions of the various commanders, what was the composition of the army, what were the numbers of various types of troops, what kind of weapons were they carrying, and stuff like that. And towards the end of the section, he says this: "How long, storied Greece, will you continue to tell us of Doriscus, the city of Thrace, and of the armies drowned up in troops within enclosures and numbered? For I am too cautious, or, to speak more truly, too timid, to exaggerate anything beyond what is proven by trustworthy and sure evidence." So why is he talking about? Why is he invoking storied Greece? Well, he's actually making a reference to a very famous passage in the first extant ancient historian that we have, Herodotus, who wrote in the 5th century BCE. And there is a very famous, he wrote about the wars between the Persians and the Greeks. And there is a very famous passage where he describes the Persian army led by Xerxes. That's the big, bold guy from the movie 300. And of course, in Herodotus, the army is massive. It's got like 3 million people in it, which is obviously exaggerated by 2 orders of magnitude, more or less. And he actually tells a really funny story about how the army was counted, because you can't easily count 3 million people. So there is a story about how that was done. Herodotus says, they were counted in this way. 10,000 men were collected in one place, and when they were packed together as closely as could be, a line was drawn around them. When this was done, the 10,000 were sent away, and a wall of stones was built around the line, reaching up to men's navel. And when this was done, others were brought into the walled space, until in this way they were all numbered. So the basic idea is, how do you count 3 million people? Well, you just count 10,000s after 10,000s until you count the whole thing, right? Is this completely ridiculous? Of course it is. Did that actually happen? Almost certainly not. And even in antiquity, people realized that this is bullshit. Definitely Ammianus Marcellinus realized that because he was a soldier and he had very practical and down-to-earth experience with army and stuff around it, right? So he basically makes fun of Herodotus by saying, how long, storied Greece, will you continue to tell us this nonsensical story about how the army was counted, right? And he then goes on to say that he's very cautious about not exaggerating the numbers involved. Interesting. What do we have here? This is the last example that I want to give you. It's a very exciting scene. Ammianus Marcellinus happened to be trapped in a city of Amida in Mesopotamia during the campaign, Persian campaign against the Romans. The city was besieged by the Persian army, and after 3 days of very intensive fighting, when like heads were split by swords and guts were flying everywhere, the city was actually conquered, and Ammianus Marcellinus very narrowly escapes. And this is what he says about himself: I myself, again, not something that we find in the Gospel of Mark or Matthew, haven't taken a direction apart from that of my comrades, was looking around to see what to do, when Vernianus, one of the guard, came up with an arrow in his thigh, and while at the earnest request of my colleague, I was trying to pull it out, finding myself surrounded on all sides by the foremost Persians, because of course you were, I moved ahead at breathless speed and aimed for the city, which from the point where we were attacked lay high up and could be approached only by a single very narrow ascent. And this was made still narrower by mills which had been built on the cliffs for the purpose of making the baths. So again, this is just him talking about himself, about the events that he himself witnessed. He was an eyewitness. He says so. He talks about himself in the first person, because why wouldn't he, right? That was just normal in the genre. And just to show you that these passages are not short, this is one of those passages at length. I'm not going to read the whole text, but I just highlighted him talking about first person. You can pause the stream later to read it, or you can actually look it up, because I, of course, include the actual reference to the specific place in the text. And this brings us to the end of the stream. And now for something completely different. So that was the topic that I wanted to cover, but I thought that it might be fun to conclude every stream by talking about like a completely different, unrelated topic for maybe 5 to 10 minutes. It's just going to be very short. I think it would be a nice change of pace, and it would give me some opportunity to geek about what I'm really interested in. And the person that I want to be talking about today is called Camilla, and she is a character in Roman mythology. She specifically shows up most prominently in the epic poem Aeneid, written by the Roman poet Virgil. And she's basically the closest in ancient literature to Xena, warrior princess, Because unlike Hercules, Xena is actually not a character from ancient history or ancient mythology. I'm not up to speed with Xena lore, but I think she was originally just a side character in the series Hercules. But then there was a spin-off show which was arguably much, much better and maybe more popular than Hercules. But Camilla is basically the closest. I wasn't able to find a depiction of Camilla from antiquity. So this is just a statue of Diana. I kind of like her chill posture. Diana was, of course, the Roman equivalent of goddess Artemis, the goddess of hunt. So this is probably how people in the ancient world imagine Camilla looking like. She was a warrior and a huntress, so even though she was a female, she basically fit into a lot of male roles in ancient society. And he died very tragically in a battle during the events of the Aeneid. What's really interesting is that even though she's a warrior, female warrior, she's not an Amazonian. Because usually, like, there are female warriors all over the ancient literature, but they are usually, although not always, there are some counterexamples to this even in Greek mythology, Amazonians, which is a nation that was supposedly either completely composed of women or it was a matriarchy. So women were actually warriors. But Camilla wasn't. She was just a noble person that happened to be female and a warrior. What I want to talk about specifically is an amazing and hilarious story from her childhood. Her father was named Metabus, which is already just brilliant. Metabus, right? It has an amazing ring to it. Mike Lacona, my favorite Christian apologist, has like one stock joke that he repeats every time, well, almost every time that he talks. And this is when he gets to talking about Polycarp, supposedly a disciple of John, one of the Johns that show up around Jesus, a disciple of Jesus. And he says, well, if you think about naming your child, you should consider the name Polycarp. But I think you should actually go with Metabus. That's much, much better. And in the Aeneid, there's a story of Metabus being chased, escaping from a troop, like a group of enemies, right? And he's running around in a forest, and he's actually carrying baby Camilla in his hands, and he's escaping from people who are trying to kill them. But then he comes to a river which was flooded, so he couldn't actually swim across the river because he had baby Camilla, right? So what to do? And then he got a brilliant idea. He took a spear or a javelin, and he actually strapped the baby to the spear with a rope, and he sent the spear with the baby flying across the river. And this is how Camilla survived, right? Here's the section from the Aeneid. I'm not going to read it because I can actually play you an audio recording of it. And that's thanks to a website called LibriVox. I'm not sure if you know about it, but if not, definitely check them out. It's basically a Wikipedia, but just for audiobooks. It's based on volunteers, and they record audio recordings, audio readings of works in the public domain, and all of their recordings are also in the public domain. And I'm just going to play a short clip of a person narrating this. Full credentials are again in the video description below. There is a chance this is not going to be heard in the stream. I have no idea how any of this works, by the way, but hopefully you will be able to hear it. It's not very long, so there's going to be a brief period of silence, but you can read it anyway, right? So let's give it a try.
Anxious, he stops a while and thinks in haste, then desperate in distress, resolves at last. A knotty lance of well-boiled oak he bore, the middle part with cork he cover'd o'er. He closed the child within the hollow space, with twigs of bending osier bound the case. Then pois'd the spear, heavy with human weight, and thus invoked my favour for the freight. Accept, great goddess of the woods, he said, sent by her sire this dedicated maid. Through air she flies a suppliant to thy shrine, and the first weapons that she knows are thine. He said, and with full force the spear he threw. Above the sounding waves Camilla flew.
Yeah, so I just find that picture hilarious, right? So I was really interested in how this was being depicted in art, right? Because if someone made a movie, which someone definitely should make a movie based on the innate, that would be absolutely awesome. Like how do you depict this, right? It would be completely laughable to have a guy strip a baby to a spear and just like send it flying across the river. So I actually looked up some artistic depictions. As far as I know, there isn't any depiction from ancient art, but there are, of course, subsequent paintings and whatnot. So here we have Metabus with Camilla. This is relatively normal, right? He's just having an epiphany and knowing exactly what he needs to do. And the baby seems chill, probably because she doesn't know what's going to happen. But then there are depictions of the actual throw. So here we have this. It looks like maybe 17th century, I don't know. And so already the logistics of the throw are very interesting. Probably the painter didn't want to depict him throwing the baby this way, so he's just throwing the javelin like this, you know. So it's going to go straight forward. I'm not sure that would work. Someone should definitely test that with the baby, though. I think that would be hilarious. And then I noticed that a lot of these artistic depictions, people essentially completely gave up on the idea that he strapped the baby to a javelin and threw it. It looks more like he's just using the javelin as a pole to kind of lift the baby over the water and put it on the other side of the river, which, if the river was just so narrow, he could probably just jump across, right? But whatever. This looks like a medieval codex, and you can read Camilla and Metabus around it. And it seems it might actually be the Innate. I'm not sure. It looks German. And here, this is the last picture. I think the author just completely gave up on trying to even depict it. I'm not 100% sure that this is supposed to be Camilla and Metabus. The internet says yes, so I'm going to buy it. And if that's the case, again, just like guy carrying a baby across the water, right? Better story than Twilight. So yeah, that was the stream. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I have to say I was really nervous, so I would definitely appreciate your encouragement. You can express it by, of course, liking the video. You can rewatch it a couple of times, maybe pause it and read some of the texts that I was showing. And definitely write a suggestion about future topics. Give me feedback about sound quality, visual quality, or anything like that. Subscribe, of course. If the stream is very successful, then maybe we are going to wake up Cam Spires himself from his eons of slumber, and he will grace us with his presence. That would be really awesome. I have to tell you, we have a lot of amazing content in store. We even managed to record some of our conversations, but unfortunately then I got a new laptop and all the recordings were lost. But as soon as he is back, we will definitely jump into it. So thanks for your attention and have a nice day.